Hello, thank you for joining me. It's good to see you again. I am Vengeance, I am Justice, I am Sungrand. Today we will be taking a look at Batman Arkham Knight on the Nintendo Switch. In this video, I want to discuss some of the causes of the performance issues. I want to explain those, so as a gamer you can understand it, but also as a developer if you are into game development and these are topics that interest you. I want to help you understand how you can avoid the issues that cause this game to have its performance issues. I'm going to discuss a wide range of topics, and I'll just run through this beginning part of the game so we can just analyze it, take a look for ourselves. So please feel free to grab yourself a coffee and we'll just enjoy taking a look at these aspects of game development here. One of the most noticeable things that you will see is lower internal rendering resolution. Say, for example, if you have a look at the fork and a knife there at the table, you can see the pixels are quite noticeable. The pixels on the napkin holder are very noticeable. As game developers, we do that so we can alleviate the amount of work that the GPU has to do. There's basically two components that are doing all the hard work. That is the CPU for the central processing unit that does the calculations like math and AI, whereas the GPU handles things like graphics processing. The more pixels you have to render internally, the more work that the hardware has to do, and that means that the worse your performance will be. In handheld mode, this is significantly more noticeable as well. You see that the developers tried to keep things low poly count on the Switch. For example, these balloons are very rough. They're not round at all. The less polygons, all these things are made out of polygons or triangles, the less triangles or polygons that are on screen, then the less work the GPU has to do. In this situation, they would have used some sort of automated system to do this level of detail to where it just has less polygons to render. So this is something that was not done manually, I would suspect. It's something that is done automatically because it looks bad. And it's very easy to avoid that. If you manually do the work, you can produce balloons that have similar poly counts, only slightly higher with negligible performance cost, and they would look much better. So there's a significant amount of level of detail work in this game that I've noticed that is automated. And unfortunately, that is something that modern game engines do to help us, but unfortunately, developers tend to overly rely on them and it results in a worse product. So this is a situation where if developers had more experience and understanding and had the opportunity to put in more manual work, the game would have turned out significantly better. You'll see low poly count on the characters here. This is something that would have been quite expensive on the Switch, these animated geometry. For example, the chairs, the furniture are not animated pieces of geometry. They're easier to render. But having this many people on screen, that's actually quite demanding. You'll notice things that are culled out. Culling is when we are far from the camera. Then we stop drawing them again to make it easier on the GPU so there's less work. If you have a look at that waitress's hair, have a look at this waitress here. I'm going to approach just a little closer here and her hair will pop in. And there we go. There it is. That hair has some transparency. On Nintendo Switch, well, on any hardware, but especially on the Switch, transparent particles are transparent geometry. Any transparent pixel is actually quite demanding in order to render. So that has a pretty significant performance cost. So I'm going to point out a number of things as well. As I see them, I haven't really scripted or rehearsed this. So as I see things, I'll just point them out. What is going on with this coffee cup? That's pretty wild. I don't know what the deal is there. It's really freaking out. Okay, so let me try to figure out what my objective is here. Something that is quite expensive, especially on the Switch, would be drawing rain particles. As I mentioned, the transparent particles are pretty expensive, so having rain present is quite demanding. Let's see here. There's a scary man. I noticed there is a rendering technique that is used here that is extremely expensive on the Nintendo Switch. It's expensive in general in terms of performance. When I say expensive, I don't mean the developers paying a monetary value. I mean that it is expensive on the hardware. On your hardware, you have a rendering budget, and that means you're allowed to have a certain amount of things before performance starts suffering. So when I say that something is expensive to render or process, it means it has a significant negative effect on the frame rate of the game. You have worse performance overall. The effects that we see here are quite expensive because, as you can see, there are many transparent particles. Say, for example, these sort of... Am I supposed to not die here? What was happening? Here we are in the city. Now we will see that we have some stuttering of the frame rate here. Again, this is a result of many things. They all contribute to the performance cost. One thing that is extremely expensive on hardware, especially on the Switch, is depth of field. Depth of field is what we call a post-processing effect. It is an effect that is applied to the end image. So the game gets rendered, then we apply our full screen effects or post-processing effects. One such effect is a blurring of the background, so things in the foreground can stay in focus and things in the background can be blurred. This helps it look photographic, it looks more realistic, and it looks more interesting. But it's very expensive. It is something that is used quite heavily in this game, and it all adds to the performance cost. You're going to see significant stuttering during this gameplay. Just as you're exploring and moving around, the game will seem to get stuck for a moment as it tries to continue forward, and I will explain that further, and as soon as I can show you a good example of that. So this is already an impressive scene to look at because there's so much geometry, but what they are drawing is actually simplified geometry. As we saw with the balloon in the restaurant, it's actually a very low quality version of the asset. And as we explore the environment and as we approach and get closer to certain pieces of geometry, we see the game will use higher quality versions of those assets. So here is a clear example of some issues here. The game is basically running like a slideshow right now. It's trying to render the rain particles. It is trying to render all of the bloom, which is expensive, the fog particles. I would have a closer look. I did perform an analysis on this before, but I believe that there may actually be some degree of actual volumetric lighting. I would have to check. The last time I had a close look at this was a few months ago, but I believe they're actually not using volumetric lighting. They're faking it with a number of different techniques that are simpler and easier to render. So let's see if I can approach my objective here. And I was hit by a vehicle. Okay. If you're a fan of these games, you may find that the graphics in this particular title are noticeably worse. They are worse quality than in previous Batman games. That is something that is interesting. Let's go ahead and Spider-Man our way up to the rooftop here, and I will see. I would like to skip this. Here you see an example of the depth of field, which again is very expensive on the Switch. Consoles like the PlayStation, Xbox, and PC have much better suited hardware for that, more efficient at rendering depth of field. You saw as I was talking to Hunnigan on my phone there, the background was blurred out. That's quite expensive. We'll see what the frame rate is like as we're gliding around. Again, we're trying to render fog and all these different particle effects, and it all adds together to result in this frame rate where it just cannot do all of these things at once. If the Switch only had to do a couple of these rendering techniques, it would not be that big of a deal, but in this situation it's trying to do too much. And I'm sure on PC and PlayStation, Xbox, would be much better than what we see now. To me, this looks like a game engine that is just not efficient, and it's certainly too heavy. So this does not look like volumetric fog to me. That looks like a simpler particle effect or geometry that is being used to render that light beam there. Okay, I'm being assaulted here. I punched a man in the side of the head. Okay, now I shall talk to this officer. That guy's neck would be broken. I would have broken that guy's neck. Something that does not really affect performance would be, say, for example, the high-resolution textures on Batman's clothing. That is something that, even if that was a very low resolution or high resolution. Oh, I'm doing a Assassin's Creed. Here we go, my leap of faith. That's pretty good. Now we will start our driving section where we get to drive the Batmobile. Something that has a performance cost as well. You see how the raindrops are actually landing on the Batmobile? So there are some calculations that are being performed in order for those raindrops to be able to collide with the Batmobile. That itself has a CPU performance cost. So here we're going to see the worst offender in terms of performance. This is what I think people think of when they see, or when they think of Batman Arkham Knight on the Switch, is this sort of performance. And it makes it very difficult to control where you're going because you just don't have enough time to perceive your environments and then to react to what is going on. So what is happening? Earlier I mentioned that to cut down on loading times, to try to make it feel like the game does not have any loading times, what they do is they only load a very small amount of data. They load the basics, and they only have the very lowest quality assets in terms of the 3D models and the textures. And they rely on automated processes from modern game engines. As you get closer to a game object, the game engine will use real-time loading to load in the higher quality assets, the 3D models and the textures. The problem is that we are now moving at high speed, and because we are moving at high speed, look at all of these different objects. Maybe there's 60 or 70 different pieces of geometry with unique materials, different textures they have to use. They are all at the same time trying to load higher quality assets at the same time. That is what is causing these issues, is all of the low quality assets are trying to replace themselves with higher quality assets, which means they have to load in. That causes the game to stutter like this. And it never ends, because as we go through the city, we keep finding more and more unique pieces of geometry. What would have solved this issue? What would have alleviated? There's so many other issues, but what would have made a huge difference and made performance better is if the game did not rely on this modern method of loading the assets in real time. There seems to be this odd fascination with getting rid of loading times in games. It feels like developers think, oh, people will hate the game if there's loading times. Well, this is a situation where the alternative is significantly worse. So great, you got rid of loading times, but now the game runs like this. This is because the game refuses to have loading times. And if we had just let the game have a longer loading time so it could load the assets instead of trying to load them in real time, if you loaded them ahead of time, this would not be happening. And it only gets worse. The faster you drive, you'll notice the more that it freezes. And that is because the faster you drive, the faster you get closer to more geometry that needs to load in higher quality assets. I'll just go as fast as I can now and see really what's going to be the absolute worst performance here. I'll go as fast as I can. This is a slideshow, so let's just pause it now. So what's going on is there are multiple post-screen effects. Those are many different things. It can be things like, I'll just have a quick look at the scene here and I'll see what I can determine just by looking at the scene. I'm trying to determine what sort of techniques they would use for reflections. I need to get close to water in order to determine what sort of reflections we have. We have so many particle effects. Again, transparent particles are quite expensive. You see the textures just loaded in. They were lower resolution. They popped in. So it was taking the time to, again, load in the higher resolution. Looks like that is the highest that resolution gets. But what happens to the game when we're trying to have real-time lighting and reflections, and which way do you want me to go, man? Is we have to calculate reflections. We have to take into account the geometry and the colors and the lights that are in the scenes, and we render out a source of reflections, and then that takes time rendering that every single frame. It has to render out and calculate new reflections every single time. Not only that, the way that I see this, I feel it's the GPU that's really struggling here. I'm not sure what rendering technique they used, but depending on how they chose to render the game, having multiple light scenes or having multiple light sources can actually cause the game to get slower. And with each light source you have, the game has to render objects another time on top of that. And having, say for example, 4 light sources all affecting one object means that object has to be drawn 4 times, has to be rendered 4 times, instead of, say for example, having 1 light source, the object is rendered only 1 time. That could be one of the issues. It depends on what their rendering methods are, but I would suspect it is something that is a combination of so many things, because this is the worst performance I've seen in any Switch title. On top of that, all of the heads-up display elements, there is a performance cost to heads-up display elements as well. We have a map over here, and updating the map every single frame as the character navigates through the world here, that also has a performance cost. We have the numbers. We have the numbers that need to calculate the position of an object in the game world. We have to calculate where its position will be on the screen. I suspect that's happening for many things as well. So there's so many different computational calculations going on top of the rendering, the very advanced visual effects that need to be taken into account. All of that piled on top of loading assets in real time. Then we also have to calculate collisions. We have the AI of people and other vehicles, and if that AI is not designed in a way that is meant to minimize the strain on the CPU, then it could very easily cause frame rates like this just on its own. So it's so many different things. It's so fascinating that it has turned out this way and that it is not fixed. This is fixable. This absolutely is fixable, but I don't know if the developers have the highly specialized skill set. This is an issue that we saw as well with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, is in order to create a game of large scale with advanced visuals on a platform like the Switch, you need to have an extremely highly specialized skill set. It doesn't matter how good of a game developer you are, it doesn't matter how competent or experienced, you still need someone with a highly specialized skill set when it comes to optimizing for certain platforms. And the Switch is a platform that requires an extremely specialized skill set. In this case of this game, they already had the base game made, so the game itself was already, pretty good. But in the case of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, they would have spent a significant amount of their development time stuck optimizing and trying to fix issues. So with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, they had less time to actually make the game itself. It resulted in an experience that some gamers just found unappealing and lacking in some ways. And that is because the developers have to waste a lot of time optimizing and getting their game to run better. This is a situation where the game was already made, and they're just porting it to the Switch. And unfortunately, whoever worked on this, bringing it to the Switch, seems to have lacked the understanding and experience. They would have thought things like, oh, we'll reduce the poly count, we'll just reduce the texture's resolution, that'll make it run better. That is not enough, and that barely has an impact on the performance of the game, what we're seeing here. There's so much that is going on here, and that's what I was explaining. So there's just so much going wrong. I believe there was height fog going on here. There's more than just a simple distance fog. I believe they're using particles to fake some volumetric fog. For example, you see localized fog particles in the distance. I would have reduced the density on all of that. I certainly would have done with far less rain particles. The rain particles can get quite expensive. Oh, this is so, oh man. I actually feel kind of sick. This is so sad because this could have worked. This really could have worked. We just stop here. There's so much bloom and fog effects going on. I believe there was height fog. I would have left out the height fog and just used distance fog, which is very simple. It's the most basic fog we have in games. We've had it for like 500 years. I would have made sure that any kind of reflections are much lower quality. I don't know what rendering technique they're using, so having multiple light sources could be causing objects to have to be rendered multiple times. There's more they could have done here. The post screen effects, you know, the effects like the bloom and the depth of field, you can change that to render at much lower resolutions, which is what I do on my Switch games. That allows me to maintain some decent performance while having access to more advanced visual effects. Things like bloom and depth of field, if you reduce the internal resolution of that stuff, you can still render your game at a higher resolution, but it means that those effects will be cheaper and easier to render. They'll look a little less defined. They'll be more blurry. They'll have less definition. But unless you're comparing side by side, it's hard to tell the difference between those things. There seems to be a lot of interactivity with the environment, which also has a significant performance cost because they have to check collisions with the Batmobile. Perhaps for the Switch version, maybe I could have left that stuff out. You could check the distance to the Batmobile and avoid processing any collision logic that way. There's so much more optimization you could have done, and what I can see here is that it doesn't seem like they implemented much at all. You see those assets loading in. It's the asset loading in real time again that is just a huge problem here. So I will go ahead, I'll call it, because I think we've discussed everything we need to discuss here. This is a fascinating case in game development. You can see the geometry loading in. See how long it took? I was sitting here for about a good 10 seconds. So that entire time we were sitting here, that was still loading in. And again, that causes the hardware to stutter. The hardware has to work in order to load that stuff in. So I'll go ahead and leave it here. I hope you found this interesting. Please let me know what your experience has been with this game. Have you played through this on the Switch, or did you play through it on a different platform? Thanks very much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll go ahead and consider some fun topics for our upcoming videos. Thanks very much. Be well. If you'd like to see some of my other videos, I'll go ahead and put them up on screen as well. Take care of yourselves. Enjoy.